Well, Bill, Ambassador, this is quite a crowd. Good evening. For those of you I haven't had a chance to welcome, I'm Jennifer Rabb and have the great privilege of serving as president of Hunter College, the place where the American dream still comes true. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program, marking yet another milestone in the long life and exemplary career of a beloved New Yorker, a great American, and above all, the quintessential friend of all things Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, the one and only Ambassador Bill vanden Heuvel. I welcome you on behalf of Rita Hauser, who I know is here in our audience, who is the chair of our Roosevelt House Advisory Board, on behalf of the extraordinary Harold Holzer, who you'll hear from soon, who is the Jonathan Fanton director of Roosevelt House, and of course, Jonathan Fanton himself here, so wonderful. I also want to acknowledge the Four Freedoms Conservancy for all they've done for the city, for keeping the spirit of Franklin and Eleanor alive, and working so closely with Bill, and for co-sponsoring tonight's reception. We're happy and very pleased to welcome its chair, Eugene Cohn, executive director, Howard Axel, and longtime advocate and friend of ours, Sally Menard. So thank you to the Roosevelts. Okay. And as always, it's always fun to welcome the contingent from what we call Frank FDR's other house, the Weekend Place, here from Hyde Park, Chris Bryseth and Fritzy Goodman. So thank you for all you do. And perhaps closest and dearest to my heart, it's just always a special pleasure to welcome to the home of a great First Lady, another phenomenal First Lady, the only woman in New York history to hold the Bible at 6 gubernatorial inaugurations, 3 for the phenomenal and missed late Mario Cuomo, and 3 for her extraordinary son, our Governor Andrew Cuomo. Please join me in welcoming our beloved Matilda Cuomo. Bill's own story is an American dream, too, where he's the son of European immigrants who settled in upstate New York and went on to send their gifted son to Cornell and then Cornell Law School. From there, Bill launched a career that embraced public service at the city, state, national, and international levels, all of which he talks about in riveting detail in the brand new book he is introducing tonight. Its title is so typical of this man who has learned so much from the lessons of the past, yet continues to focus on the future. The memoir is called, appropriately, Hope and History. And what better place could there be for the debut of this book than at Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt's own home? This building would never have been saved, rehabilitated, and repurposed into a Hunter College Public Policy Institute without the inspiring help and relentless nudging, I must say, of our beloved Bill. After 6 decades as a Hunter College facility, a place designated for Hunter clubs and social events, open to women of all races and religions, had begun to reflect the inevitable wear and tear. It was closed for 10 years, and there were those who advised us to sell it before it fell down and reap the neat profit of an Upper East Side townhouse. Bill not only implored us to save the house, to be honest, he insisted, and he helped make this miracle happen. The man who had been a Roosevelt admirer all his life and enlisted Eleanor as an ally at the beginning of his own political career was not about to let this shrine to the Roosevelts fall out of public and educational use. Ever since, Bill has been an eloquent spokesman for what this building has meant to the American memory and what it still means to our students and faculty as a center for public policy, human rights, and community engagement. In gratitude, Hunter awarded Bill an honorary degree in 2004. So he is not only a Hunter advocate, in a sense, he's a Hunter graduate too. Bill, again and always, thank you for your inspiration, and thank you tonight for bringing, as part of Hunter, your wonderful family, Ashley, Katrina, Alexander, and of course the wonderful Melinda. So to all the vanden Heuvels, thank you. And of course, like Bill himself, Roosevelt House remains a vibrant living landmark, a place where history happened and still does. For those of you who may not know the backstory, it was here that Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt lived from 1908 until 1933, right up until the time they departed for Washington for the presidential inauguration. Originally, FDR's mother, Sarah, built the house as a wedding present for the newlyweds. Then she threw in a bonus gift. She would live in the adjoining townhouse. And as a further surprise, she took down the walls that separated the two. As Eleanor later delicately put it, her mother-in-law was thereafter on her side of the building 24 hours a day, sometimes, quote, at the least expected moments. FDR went on to recover from polio here. He learned to use his famous armless wheelchair here, took his first steps on braces upstairs, literally crawled across the library for hours at a time to build up his upper body strength, and ultimately regained his shattered self-confidence here as well, just as Eleanor expected. From this spot, he ran successful campaigns for governor of New York and president of the United States. Then, after the election of 1932, this building served as the transition headquarters where Roosevelt and his brain trust developed the foundation blocks of the New Deal. They included one particularly innovative plan introducing federal old age pensions, a program hatched just upstairs in FDR's private library. Today, we know it as the foundational bedrock of the social safety net, Social Security. And we are so immensely proud it was born right here on 65th Street. I do have to say, though, and you love this, Matilda, we often talk about Eleanor Roosevelt in this house, and then we talk about her a little more, and we talk about her a little more. And Bill will have to pull me aside and say, yes, Jennifer, but FDR was president. As his brand new memoir shows, Bill vanden Heuvel has been part of the Roosevelt world for as long as he can remember, from his boyhood in Rochester to the present. There is his longtime support for the FDR Presidential Library at Hyde Park, the founding of the Franklin Eleanor Roosevelt Institute, and the creation of the Four Freedoms Park on Roosevelt Island. All these places, which combine a reverence for history with a vision for the future, they all reflect Bill's devotion to the hard but necessary work of perpetuating the Roosevelt's legacy in the 21st century. And as we, his fan base, well know, Bill has done so much more, serving as an aide to Robert F. Kennedy, as the reform-minded chairman of the New York City Board of Corrections, as a U.S. ambassador to the European Office of the UN, and as chairman of the Council of American Ambassadors, truly a diplomat's diplomat. His new book not only reminds us with self-effacing modesty, but a real sense of purpose, how very much Bill has seen and done. It demonstrates why, as Doris Kearns Goodwin has written in tribute, his entire career, quote, reminds us of how honorable public service can be. That miraculous career is still going on. Tonight marks just the start of Bill's many public appearances to introduce hope and history. He has a string of gigs over the next few weeks, and let's face it, he's inexhaustible. Last month, he celebrated his 89th birthday. We all want to grow up to be just like Bill vanden Heuvel. Bill, you truly are a national treasure, and we treasure you. So, as Bill talks about his newly released memoir with Harold Holzer, the Jonathan Fenton director of Roosevelt House, we are all really waiting to hear the full story. Some of you may not know, but Bill actually was on the search committee that found the extraordinary Harold Holzer for this role. But Bill had a little bit of a worry, Matilda, because Harold, as we all know, is one of the country's top experts on Lincoln, and Bill was just a little bit worried about the whole Lincoln-Roosevelt thing. But as you'll be able to see from this conversation, Harold is extraordinarily versatile and shares Bill's devotion, of course, to Roosevelt. So it is great, really with pleasure, that we bring up our wonderful Harold Holzer, Jonathan Fenton director, the extraordinary Bill vanden Heuvel, and all remember that happy days are here again, Bill.
In closing, no. How can we top your eloquence with my inarticulate questions?
Well, you speak Lincoln and I'll speak Roosevelt.
By the way, what Jennifer said is true, but it was worse than she said. So I came for my board interview, and the first question I got was from Bill, and it wasn't exactly, I wouldn't say it was unfriendly, but it was challenging.
It was, yeah.
You said, how do we know that you will not try to make Roosevelt House Lincoln House? And I said, you don't. Anyway, It's an honor to talk to you, always, privately, publicly. So my first question, Ambassador, is you've waited quite a while to write the memoir we all hoped you would get to write. Why did you decide to do it now?
Well, the game's almost over, right?
Why did you not do it sooner? How about that?
I may have done it sooner if possible. I think this is a time for people who have thought through the problems of government, who've worked in government, people who come out of a liberal culture. This is a very challenging, tough time. And I thought that perhaps some of the experiences that I've had would be useful, certainly to remember them, certainly to remember some people who did great things. And I start the book, as you know, by talking about mentors. And I cite two people who were mentors in my life. One was Roger Baldwin, who was and they both come out of World War I. And they came about because I was in Virginia at a college one day, and I was asked to give a lecture on World War I. And I said, I'm going to do it in the context of two lives that have been very meaningful to me. One is William J. Donovan, Wild Bill Donovan, the greatest military hero of the First World War, a man who won every medal the country ever gave, a citizen soldier, but a man of enormous power and influence, who then founded the OSS, is the father of American intelligence, was a classmate of Franklin Roosevelt at Columbia. As a conservative Republican, as a liberal Democrat, they worked together very effectively as a team. The other was Roger Baldwin, who went to prison in World War I because he was so opposed to the kind of, to what the war represented. And he was a marvelous prisoner. And when he came out, he came out and he founded the American Civil Liberties Union. I don't know of a more important organization in America today as what relates to the American Civil Liberties Union. And so that was the beginning of this thing, an essay that I wrote about Donovan and Baldwin. And then I think Joe Lillyfeld, one day in this very room, stopped me and said, Bill, you should do a book. So I did it. Thank you.
And you've actually spoken about the influence that both men had on you here. So let's go back a bit. Is it true that you spoke Dutch as your first language?
We spoke Flemish at home.
Flemish.
My mother was Belgian, my father was Dutch. They met in America. They both were over 30 when they came to America. My mother lived on the edge of the battlefield of Ypres, for those who are familiar with World War I, where 1 million men were killed. My mother lost her first husband. She brought her 2 young sons who were born during the First World War to America. So that was, my father was Dutch, and he came to America for economic reasons, hopefully. But we were a poor working class family in Rochester, New York. My mother organized a boarding house. Doesn't everybody come from a boarding house? Thomas Wolfe did. Now he's forgotten. When you mention Thomas Wolfe now, it's white suit. But the Thomas Wolfe I identified with was in the 1930s. It was this wonderful writer and who grew up in a boarding house.
Look homeward to a boarding house. Why Rochester? Why did they
My
settle
mother had a brother who lived in Rochester and who was very unhappy that we were coming.
But you describe it as a town that was divided.
Oh, Rochester was wonderful.
No. As divided between pro-New Deal and anti-New
Well,
Deal.
it was divided between the rich and the poor.
Yeah.
I mean, Franklin, George Eastman lived on one side and we lived on the other. So you could say, well, I lived near George Eastman. And he was a wonderful man. I mean, I didn't know him. He committed suicide in 1932. He was one of the richest men in America.
But it was a Kodak town, right?
It was a Kodak town. 45,000 people in Rochester worked for Eastman Kodak. And it was, everything was built by George Eastman. The schools, the hospitals, the dental dispensary, all of these great things. And Rochester was a very special town for that reason. And I was very fortunate to have teachers who were interested in me. And although my parents didn't speak English very well, People appreciated the effort that everybody made, and we all worked like hell.
I didn't know until I read the book that you knew Midge Costanza,
Midge Costanza.
who I knew in politics in the 70s. When she was
Midge
vice mayor of Rochester.
Midge Costanza was a candidate for Congress. She was in high school. We were in high school together. And when the time came to meet with Jimmy Carter and decide on who should run his campaign, believe it or not, Midge Costanza was from Rochester, and I was from Rochester, and we did it together.
Well, they ventured far afield. Midge and Bella Abzug were fired by President Carter on the same day. Just saying.
They were what?
Fired from the National Women's Commission.
Fired?
Yeah.
Oh. She lasted that long, did she?
You describe in the book, I found this fascinating too, predating your intellectual and political affinity for FDR, that your family boarding house was, in a sense, saved by an early New Deal program, right?
That's right. I mean, the Mortgage Foreclosure Act, my mother had a third mortgage on the boarding house from an old German boarder, and it must have cost her $5 a week to service the mortgage. But we were about to be foreclosed when the moratorium came. So Roosevelt was a very personal figure in our home. It was not only the President of the United States that you looked up to. He was a person who came into your living room and shook your hand and said, I know what's problem. I'm going to help you. So I was a certified Democrat at the age of 7.
When the program literally came home.
Although my parents were not political at all, and I really forced them. I made my mother go with me to an I Am an American Day so we could meet Eleanor Roosevelt. I took my mother to a rally at the garden, at the auditorium, to hear Charles Lindbergh. I was very determined that Roosevelt's success was our success. And when the war came, and my parents both had large families, left in Holland and Belgium, it was very meaningful to them how Roosevelt identified with us.
And you said that you sensed a transformation with the beginning of the war, that the old divisions in Rochester, where people had opposed Roosevelt, you sensed a new kind of unity around the war.
Well, there was nothing more unifying in my lifetime than Pearl Harbor. I mean, whatever anybody felt on December 6, 1941, was nothing compared to what we felt on December 7th. And the nation was together, and those who had been hostile, those who hated Roosevelt, were pushed aside, and the enormous force of a unified nation came and brought our production capacity to extraordinary levels and played the role that won the war. Roosevelt was a great war leader. There's a new book that was here last week by Nigel Hamilton, and I think it was written 3 volumes on Roosevelt. When I reviewed the presidents of the United States in my lifetime, I am awfully glad that I had the time and energy to spend that time with Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. They were wonderful, wonderful people, and they were determined to do good. And they did. And Eleanor Roosevelt is kind of heard that. She lived until 1962. And so I had the opportunity to really work with her closely and to be her friend. So it was an interesting juxtaposition.
Do you remember that first meeting before you were 20? Did you actually get to talk to her?
No, yes, that was in Eastman Hall of Music in Rochester. It's where I took my mother. It was I Am an American Day. And at the end of it, I was 9 years old.
Oh, 9.
9 years old. At the end of it, I come up and my mother said, I said, come with me. And I took her up, and there was this towering woman, this blessed soul. And I said, oh, Mrs. Roosevelt, may we say hello? And we did, and never forgot it, and it meant so much to all of us.
And another great story in the book involves your first fundraising campaign to get you the funding necessary to go to the first anniversary of the Roosevelt funeral, right? Didn't your friends?
Well, I mean, I was identified by my classmates, and I was probably looked upon as very strange. I mean, I wore a mourning band on my arm. I think I was the only person who did that. But the point, then they raised money when the president died and allowed me to go to Hyde Park when the family gave the estate to the government of the United States. And that was the first time I met Harry Truman. And the whole New Deal was there, and I was 14 years old. And it was just a great moment to see what Roosevelt meant to America.
And Bill is always here at Roosevelt House for Roosevelt programs. And if someone dares to suggest that Roosevelt was indifferent to the suffering of the Holocaust or could have bombed railroad lines with specificity, Bill is there to make his point, as you did in, I remember when the article came out, and my friend Richard Snow was the editor of American Heritage. I remember that article. You are a very persuasive narrative historian in your own right. And we just heard last week together when someone overstated American bombing capacity, I think.
Well, I mean, the issue of the Holocaust in the United States and the issue of the Holocaust in Roosevelt is an issue that means a great deal to a number of people. My dear friend Fritzie Goodman, who's been my associate in Roosevelt Enterprises for so many years, told me that in her synagogue she was surprised that young Jews were so hostile to Roosevelt. And I said, why? She says, because he didn't do enough. Well, that was in 1993 that began. Arthur Schlesinger, my great beloved colleague in all of these things, and I spent the next 30 years answering that question. And in this book is an essay that I wrote on America and the Holocaust. And if I may just say about it, John Lukács, the historian who we met you just referred to, and who died last week at the age of 95, wrote a letter to the editor of the American Heritage magazine saying it was the best, most effective statement relating to that difficult question that he had ever read. So that gave me some status among Holocaust scholars, which is not an easy. I was told over and over again by the scholars, you shouldn't be at this meeting. You shouldn't be talking about this. You are not a scholar. I didn't realize how closed a society all of that was. But I'll tell you, if you fight hard, you can get inside.
We welcome you now. That was our deal when you were worried about Lincoln House. I said we'd welcome you into the fraternity of historians. True to my word. Let's go back to Wild Bill Donovan. So you graduate from law school, editor of Law Review, right? Cornell and Cornell Law, and you go to a law firm and you encounter this legendary figure.
The war was on.
Right.
The war in Korea. And I had to go with all of us. In those days, were drafted if you didn't enlist. So I enlisted as I graduated from law school, but before being called up, I accepted a position with the Donovan Law Firm because several of its key partners had gone to the school I went to in California, Deep Springs. And one of the first nights when I was working very late in the library, General Donovan, whom I had only cursorily met at one occasion, came into the library and he said, young man, can you help me? I need some research. I'm debating Estes Kefauver tomorrow on whether or not the Democratic Party has been good for America in the last 20 years. Can you help me organize my research? Well, if you ever sensed the temerity of someone, there I said to him, General, let me say to you, I'm a Democrat, and I'm a Rooseveltian Democrat. I said, I don't think I can tell you so much what you should say, but I can tell you what Kefauver is going to say. And maybe building on that, that'll be helpful. We worked through the night, and I went with him to the debate the next day. He swamped Kefauver, and we stayed together for the rest of his life.
Including a stint in Thailand, which in the middle of the French...
Donovan was 70 years old when I met him. I was 22. Donovan was a great friend of Eisenhower. I can't begin to tell you how he was respected in military circles. The top generals of the nation stood up when Bill Donovan came into a room. But he was also a chairman of the International Rescue Committee. And in 1956, the revolution in Hungary began. And Donovan, there was no war in the world that Donovan didn't visit personally in the course of his time. And the Hungarian Revolution was no exception. And we flew over with Leo Chern and Andrew Duke and organized relief operations and went into Hungary, met Molitor, met Nagy, saw Cardinal Vincente, and saw the bravery of those wonderful young freedom fighters. I thought about it this morning as I saw our president sitting there with the Prime Minister of Hungary today, Orbán, who's a neo-fascist. And that what we fought for with the freedom fighters was so meaningful. And I just wondered how their children and grandchildren looked upon this episode. 2 weeks ago, I spoke at a memorial for Randy Abraham, who was 95, one of the great Holocaust scholars, certainly the preeminent scholar on Hungary. When he was 93, 2 years ago, he sent back the medals and the honors that Hungary had given him, and they were plentiful, because he objected to what Erdogan was doing to the university that he just murdered and forced out of Hungary. And he objected to the anti-Semitism of what the current Hungarian government. For a president of the United States to sit down and give the seal of approval to someone who has the anti-Semitic record of the leaders of Hungary today was just flabbergasting to me. Anyway, Donovan this was the last great public effort of his life, was the revolution. We saw a lot of young people killed, but we saw a nation emerge with a spirit. And the real lesson of Hungary was that no matter what the Soviets said, they were vulnerable because the satellite countries would never fight for them. And we saw that. The other major thing was that I was in Vietnam with Donovan when the French were still there. So I was at the age of 22 listening and working with Donovan and often into Saigon and Hue, because that was the president wanted Donovan's private advice on what was happening in Vietnam. He said it, he knew it, I certainly knew it. That was not a war you could win, nor should we win it. It was a war against colonialism, and he identified the sense that colonialism was over. He told the French time and again, get out, that the time is over for that. Trusteeship territories can be your bridge. So we were there, I was with him in Saigon, then Bangkok, on the day that Dien Bien Phu fell, and the French arbitrarily and quickly left. But I've stayed involved with Vietnam all those years. I knew Ngo Dinh Diem rather well through Donovan, Colonel Lansdale, and all those legendary figures of those days. But the sadness of it was to see America so involved, finally, in a thing that we never should have been involved in. So
one of the neat things about the memoir is that Bill reprints sections of diary entries that he wrote decades ago. I mean, you probably omit the ones where you made wrong predictions, but some of the comments, I mean, the comments from the French fall in Vietnam are amazing. You clearly are upset with the French, you blame the French, but you talk about the hopelessness of colonial rule in Southeast Asia. So the prescience of this man when he was in his 20s is extraordinary. So you don't have to really revise yourself. There was a lot of wisdom there, Bill, and it's very refreshing to read unedited, unexpurgated diary entries that you were smart enough to keep.
I lived with the ambassador at the residence. He hadn't brought any of his family over. Night after night, it was just the two of us having dinner. And I think he had pleasure, and I certainly had pleasure in learning all about him and learning the events he'd gone through. That doesn't happen very much to older people. It's not easy to get your grandchildren to find out what you're interested or what you've done. And so for Donovan, I think I was the young son, or the young grandson perhaps, who really admired him so. And we talked very frankly. I mean, if you read my diary entries, I'm just almost embarrassed about how strongly I talked to him. And about the war in Vietnam, for example, trying to say this was not something we couldn't win. And we saw the most interesting people, everybody who came into that part of the world. I was reminded of the other day when Jane Reisman died. Some of you, she's a great patroness of the Metropolitan Museum. She and her husband, who then owned Standard Oil of Kansas, came through Bangkok while we were there. And I took them to Angkor Wat. And her husband was a man of very reactionary tendencies. So the general asked him, he said, "What would you do, Charlie, in terms of this problem, Bandung and what was happening?" He said, "I tell you what I'd do. I'd crawl along the street with my nose on the ground until I got to the palace where old Nehru was sitting. And I'd go up there and I'd say, 'Oh, holy mighty Nehru, how we all admire you. But if you don't do what we say, the next 24 hours, I'm going to blow the hell out of you.'" So you saw America in many different places.
I didn't even know you knew the Reismans.
Yes.
No, I knew Jane, of course, but not Charlie. He was gone. So 1960 is a watershed in your life and in the book because you run for Congress, you meet Robert Kennedy, you're involved in the Kennedy campaign, all of this confluence of political and reform activity. And I love the fact that Eleanor is doing street campaigning for you in 1960. We won't talk about Lindsay winning, but you did. It was clearly the year that you began.
And Adlai Stevenson, he was a major force in this congressional thing. And John Lindsay was not a friend. We ran against each other, and he beat me soundly. But we admired and respected each other. And interestingly, I met him in Hungary. He was working for the Department of Justice with Joe Swing on immigration. And he had his eyes set on the 17th Congressional District. And I had run the campaign in the 17th District for Tony Akers. And we spent a whole trip from Vienna back to New York talking about politics in that district and building his career. He deserved better than it all ended up, in my judgment. And we remained colleagues. I mean, when the crisis in the prisons developed and there were several suicides in 1 week, he called me and asked me if I would take over the Board of Correction as his chairman. And I did, and it was, I think in his judgment at least, and mine too, it was a very successful opportunity.
And again, when you read this, and I know you will, the diary entries, this man was suggesting, proposing, introducing criminal justice reform long before it was fashionable. And the examples run throughout that period of the book. But in 60, before you had that opportunity, were you present at the first meeting between Eleanor Roosevelt and John Kennedy?
Yes.
Tell us about that. That's extraordinary.
Well,
I mean, she had been for Stevenson for a third nomination, right?
But Mrs. Roosevelt wrote a column in her daily column about John Kennedy. And she said, one problem is that he has too much profile, not enough courage.
Wow. That's tough.
That was not well received at the Kennedy residences. So Mrs. Roosevelt lived on 74th Street, 74th and Park. And it was my congressional district. And so the president frequently, then John Kennedy, senator, stayed at the Carlisle Hotel. And I had my headquarters with, which Katrina doesn't remember, but she's photographed there all the time, at 75th and Madison. So John Kennedy, they asked me if I would go with him as a congressional candidate. So I brought him to the house, and then, of course, he knew Mrs. Roosevelt. She was very gallant. Listen, she was going to do anything to beat Nixon. So anything that Kennedy wanted her to do, she was quite prepared to do it. He also went up to Hyde Park to see her, too. So she became, I think, a strong supporter of his. And they all, you know, that group all had its own problems dealing with Joe Kennedy. And frequently the fiat attitudes were part of that. I once went, Thomas Hart Benton was a friend of mine, and he did the murals in the Truman Library in Missouri. And he invited me to come out and stay with him when they were being dedicated. And he had over to the house his very good friends, Bess and Harry Truman. So there we were, just the five of us having dinner, and on the prelude to Chief Justice Warren coming to dedicate the murals. But it was interesting, it was right after the election. And Truman said, one-term president, Kennedy. He said, country doesn't want a Catholic president. And then he ran against the weakest Republican that could have been put up and barely beat him. He said, look at here in Missouri. Stuart Symington won by 508,000 votes. Kennedy won by 2,600. And he went through about 7 or 8 of the different states to show how the impact of what he believed to be solely the Catholic identity hurt him and was going to be cost him the possibilities of re-election. And he said that Sam Rayburn and he had been very much opposed to Kennedy. He said, we didn't know him, but we were really opposed to his father. He said, so we've now had to rationalize it, that perhaps the only thing the president's inherited from his father is his money. And I'm sure they straightened many things, but that was an interesting insight into how the generation that competed with Joe Kennedy, who left many scarred and fragile bodies lying on the battlefield.
Certainly with the Roosevelts.
Yes, and
wanted
certainly
them to
with
come
Roosevelt.
back from England as soon as possible.
No, I mean, Truman said that night. He said, after I was nominated for vice president, I came to Boston. Says Kennedy came over to the hotel to congratulate me on my nomination, and he said, Harry, what the hell are you doing running with that crippled son of a bitch? He said, he's not going to win this election.
The rest is history. Great stories, aren't they amazing? I want to spend some time with the man on the cover of the book, the other man on the cover of the book, Robert Kennedy. And aside from the great stories you tell about all your encounters with the senator, you make a case for it to explain his transition, his journey, and his evolution from a McCarthy committee attorney to what you call a revolutionary and reformer. How do you think and you observed a great deal of it, how did he make that progression?
I don't think you can identify him as a McCarthy committee person. He worked for the committee, but he was hired by John Stennis. And the people that he worked, McCarthy was on the committee and a very powerful force on it. And Roy Cohn was the counsel to the committee, and Bobby was the Democratic counterpart to Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn was one of the most evil men in American public life. And anything that he represented, you're seeing today, because he was the closest advisor to Donald Trump that could be identified. So Bobby was a conservative man by nature. All of them loved their father and very respectful of his opinions. But he once said to me something that is apropos of nothing, but he says, Eleanor Roosevelt couldn't give it up. She was so determined to stay in public life that she nominated Adlai Stevenson in 1960 for president. She said, instead of giving her power to her sons, and she said, my father knew when his public life was over, and he gave his strength and his support to each of us.
Interesting story.
And that was a major difference between the Roosevelts and the Kennedys. Bobby, I think, learned one of the singular qualities of the Kennedys. They never stopped learning. And they were people and men who really looked at situations with a fresh eye and were not afraid to be told they were wrong. They had, at St. Gillian's, they had also as their counselor one of the most brilliant men in America, Ted Sorensen. And it worked out so beautifully well that the speeches the president gave were so meaningful. But Bobby, in the first part of his career, was the defender of the president. He was Attorney General, and he was a campaign manager, and he was someone who was determined to save the president from all of the insults and crowning displays of emotion that they felt. After the president's death, and he became his own man, he came to feel deeply the problems of injustice in his country. He knew this, he was quite prepared. He knew the obligations of security of the president, all of those things, and he could have done them brilliantly. But he was someone who hated bullies and who hated injustice. And it moved him deeply in the remaining years of his life. His children reflect it today. In my judgment, he would have been a very great president. You know, you think back of what we lost as a nation in the 1960s. We lost 3 of our greatest citizens. We lost John Kennedy, who at the prime of life and with success in every area available to him. But the sun shining bright in Texas as he arrived is mowed down by a nameless assassin who has no real meaning. You think of Martin Luther King, this great man who had led the fight in a way that the country had to accept it, murdered. And you think of Robert Kennedy, murdered. It's a loss, and not many nations could endure that kind of a loss. In the space of just several years, to lose 3 very great leaders.
I want to just ask you one more story, to relate one more story, and then we're going to give you an opportunity to talk about the hope part of your title. We're doing a lot of the history, and hope gets top billing in the book. Everyone knows Bill is, his vision is always forward, always on the future. But I think the audience, because no one has seen the book, right? It's being published tomorrow. We're all getting a preview here. There is an extraordinary story. So Bill is sent by President Carter to Geneva as the UN permanent representative in Europe. And you head off after you get ensconced there to meet Katrina, 18-year-old Katrina vanden Heuvel, at the airport. Tell me when you want to pick up the story.
Well, the Marine Guard said, the airport may be closed, Mr. Ambassador. I said, well, I'm going to go meet my daughter. I get there, and it's closed because my daughter's on a plane that has just been hijacked. And the word is sent in to us that unless Rudolf Hess is released from Spandau prison by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the plane is going to be blown up.
This is the last Nazi prisoner.
Yeah,
The last.
Rudolf Hess, as you all know, landed in Great Britain on May 10th, 1940, as the Vice Chancellor of Germany, presumably to explore surrender terms by the British.
And Sirhan. It's in the book.
And
yeah.
also they demanded the release of
Right.
Sirhan.
Now, if I'm the head of that office, or Secretary General, or the President, I am not going to let the father of one of the people, the hostages, do negotiating. But Bill vanden Heuvel was the father. Who better to trust to do what's right for the country and the world and his daughter all at the same time? So,
Well, actually, I started out the negotiation, talked to the pilot on the plane through our transmissions, and said that my daughter was on the plane, and I didn't want to have her shown any special protections or anything of the kind, but at the same time, I didn't want her to be picked out because she was the ambassador's daughter and something would happen to her. So there was nobody to negotiate with. The person who had dropped this message on the pilot's lap during the darkness of the night just said this was going to happen, and I have a bomb in my luggage in the plane, and at 4 o'clock I'm going to detonate it. But he didn't identify himself at any time during the discussions. So Secretary Vance and I then decided that it was better to have someone other than an American go on the plane. And the president of Switzerland came down. And at a given signal, the plane was charged. And I never saw people get off a plane so fast in my life. I think Katrina was still writing an op-ed piece or something.
It's just one of many extraordinary, maybe all but unknown or forgotten stories that you brought back to life in this extraordinary book, which I know we'll all want to get upstairs when we have the opportunity. So Bill is asked, again, the hope part being his lead, to have the opportunity to talk a little bit without my interfering. I think you should do it from your
The
seat.
price of my appearance, which was very low.
Right, the usual.
I merely asked Jennifer and Harold if I could say a few words on my own about where we are as a country today, and perhaps offer a few thoughts. This title of this book is Hope in History. It's from a poem by Seamus Heaney after the death of Mandela. The quote from the poem that so moved me was, history says, don't doubt on this, do not hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise again, and hope and history can rhyme. That so struck me when I read it. So when I got around to writing a book, I wanted to use that, and so I did. The book is about the telling of the excitement and the opportunity of America. It's about the importance of heroes and mentors, Roger Baldwin and Wild Bill Donovan, two people who were very important in my young life and very important to the nation. It's about internationalism, a war in Vietnam, a peace in Europe. It's about our nation's prisons and the painful reality that almost 2 million people are confined in prison as we meet here tonight. It's about the massive resistance by the state of Virginia against the Supreme Court decision in Brown against Board of Education, and the desegregation saga of Prince Edward County. It's about the Kennedys, an extraordinary family who made extraordinary sacrifices for America. And it's about the United Nations, Jimmy Carter, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. It's told through the experience of living in a liberal society. And it's asking each of us, whatever we are, whoever we are, wherever we are, to find a way to make this country better and stronger. Americans are confronted today with the most fundamental clash of values that we have seen in our time. It is certainly a time of profound concern, but it is also a time of opportunity, a time of hope. But hope is something more than the optimism that things are going to be all fine and work out. It has to be about really finding the conviction that there is great work to be done and that we can do it. That's what the optimism of this day has to represent. It's time for history, to remember who we are, and to ask ourselves whether freedom, liberty, and justice are still the watchwords of our democratic society. It is time to remember Franklin Roosevelt's great speech in January 1941, with the terrible possibilities of war and what it would cost in lives and resources before him. He spoke to the nation and to the world and said the only thing that could possibly justify the sacrifices that were going to be met was that we had to create a different world. It had to be the world that was based on values and justified what would have happened. And he talked of the four freedoms for the first time. Freedom of expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. That's the world that Franklin Roosevelt envisioned. He was a practical man, and he knew it could come about in our own time and generation. It hasn't. But one of the greatest responsibilities we have today is to keep the United Nations in focus. It's the first time in the history of the world that all the nations of the world have agreed to sit at the same table. And even though now, by the administration that's running our government, the UN will be insulted and hurt in many, many different ways, it's our task to make sure that it survives, and it survives with the flexibility and the strength so that when the time comes, the United Nations again can be a strong general force. It's 1981. President Carter asked me to go to New Jersey to make the award of the Presidential Medal of Freedom to Roger Baldwin. He was 97, the last months of his life. But as I finished that presentation, he stood up, went to the lectern, and gave a 10-minute speech. But he said the one thing that I never forgot: we cannot bear that America fail in democracy and in justice. All the things that happen in this country, we must not fail to recognize that is our historical obligation. The election of 2016 put our country in the hands of a cabal of fortune hunters and con artists who think that history began with their election to office. They have no respect for the struggles of the last 75 years. They have no idea the struggles, what those lies have contained. They have mastered the art of insults and threat. They are bullies, and they have the character and the integrity of bullies. They have humiliated good and decent people, and they have demeaned our allies and given comfort to enemies of peace and social justice. They have given us an authoritarian government without respect for democracy. They have fanned the fires of racism in the most terrible way. They have pretended to a patriotism while insulting authentic heroes. John McCain, for example, whose service to his country is legendary, while their own is non-existent. There is little talk of peace in our society today. Even at the United Nations, where the prevention of war is a primary mission, there is again a sense of fatalism. Valiant efforts are reduced to failure. The Syrian Civil War was an example. The great powers could have stopped it, but they didn't. Ancient countries have been destroyed, and any pretense of civilization was ravaged by 600,000 people being killed. 600,000 people were killed, and there's hardly a person you know who can tell you what the war was about. It has produced refugees and displaced populations that number in the millions, and whose attempted migration to Western Europe undermined the governments of the nations that had been our principal allies. Today, we're facing a potentially existential challenge: climate control, Iran, nuclear weapons, changes in the INF Treaty. It hurt me so one day last week, after the president announced that he was going to withdraw from the INF Treaty, to see the picture of Gorbachev and Reagan signing that treaty, and to recall the immense strength and commitment that it took to do that. For President Reagan, who came from a different kind of political background, but who always loved Franklin Roosevelt, and Gorbachev, who, had he survived as a leader of the Soviet Union, in my judgment, would have introduced us to the possibilities of a very different world. The one thing I must say to all of us today, and to anyone who would listen, The one legacy that we cannot leave to our children is the beginning of another Cold War. The Cold War cost us trillions of dollars. It jeopardized our values time and time again. And it's time that we must understand that to find peace requires a dedication to peace. You're not going to get peace if you start off with John Bolton at your side telling you what our policy should be in Iran. In our lifetime, we have witnessed the greatest barbarism in human history, the Nazis and what they did in the Holocaust, and the terrible human cost of the Second World War. We have been constantly reminded that the veneer of civilization is very thin. But that's the struggle. That's the struggle to make the roots of civilization deeper and stronger, and to accept and discharge our responsibilities of citizens of a great world. One day in Bangkok, I went to the airport to bring, as a guest of General Donovan, a woman named Countess Dinhoff. Maybe many of you knew her. She was a great German woman, founder of the site, I think, in Germany with Helmut Schmidt. And I said to her as just a young, how could it be that Germany, this great country, this home of Beethoven and Mozart, this country that brought us great literature and great hope, how could it be that Germany could produce Nazism and be the most vicious, violent oppressor of humankind ever known? And she said, Lieutenant, let me tell you, it doesn't happen that way. She said, if anybody had told us in 1932 or 1933 that Hitler in 8 years would have reorganized my country so that I couldn't feel myself a citizen of it, I wouldn't have believed it. But it happens. And there were constitutional protections to see to it that it wouldn't happen. It happens if you have a dedicated force on the other side that is determined to pay no attention to democratic values in the process of protecting and who they are and gaining your country's strength. And that's why it's so important, even if we're not successful today, that we do everything that has to be done to say no to what is being perpetrated. In my lifetime, the tidal wave of justice did rise in the person and the leadership of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who led our nation through the darkness of economic depression and terrible war. The tidal wave of justice will rise again in your lifetime. Welcome it, strengthen it, make it happen. History says, said Sean Reading, history says don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and history and hope can rhyme. Don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and the hopes of history and rhyme can come together. Let us cause hope and history to rhyme again. Thank you.
No, there are only 21 candidates for president, and 89 is the new 63. So this is the beginning of a movement, I think.
I'm too young for that stuff.
So we do have time for a few questions, and I think we have a handheld mic in the back. Please wait for the mic because we're recording on YouTube. And here's the first question right here.
Thank you again for a wonderful evening. What was General Donovan's belief in what America's involvement in Vietnam should be?
What did he believe America's involvement in Vietnam should be, or should not be?
The OSS had a strong working relationship with Ho Chi Minh. The OSS had spy centers in French Vietnam and also in independent Thailand. So one of the reasons Eisenhower sent Donovan to Southeast Asia was because he could talk to almost everybody on both sides of the question, because the OSS had been on that side of the question. He thought the French, it was a mistake for us to identify with the past, namely the colonial powers. And when they organized CETO, and Great Britain and France were the guaranteeing powers in CETO, he said that's a disaster. You had to find a force in Vietnam that was nationalistic, acceptable to the people, and that could prevail. For a long time, we believed No Dinh Diem was that force, because you were not going to get the Congress of the United States or anyone to accept Ho Chi Minh. But, and he was. No Dinh Diem, in my judgment, was an honorable and decent man, destroyed in part by his brother and his wife, but a man who really was dedicated to the independence of his country. But he lost. The turning point was in the Geneva Agreements in 1954. We had all agreed that there would be an election in Vietnam that would determine whether North and South stayed together or what. We made it impossible for that election to take place. We started at that point to make it our war. And I think, as Jack Kennedy knew better than anyone, you could not win that war. The Vietnamese could win it, and we could help them, and we could supply them, and we could advise them. But it was their war to win. He said it on September 6, 1963, in a conversation on television with Walter Cronkite, that this was Vietnam's war. We believed that they had to, we had come out of Korea. The UN had prevailed by at least saving South Korea. Just look at that peninsula, what a difference it would be had we not done that. You have the lunatic asylum of the North, and you have one of the most powerful, energetic countries in South Korea that you can imagine. We thought that was a possibility in Vietnam.
Questions? Right here.
You mentioned you mentioned Gorbachev in your remarks. I note that the man who introduced me and most of the people in this room to Gorbachev is with us this evening, Steve Cohen. By small coincidence, he's your son-in-law. And I was curious what influence he may have had on your appreciation of Gorbachev, and what was the tenor of your exchanges around that subject?
I believe that Steve, who's one of the preeminent scholars in America on Russia, I believe with him that Gorbachev would have made a great difference in our world. They stay very closely in touch with Gorbachev. He's, I think, the godfather of my granddaughter, and he's a wonderful and great man. And if you read what he said while he was heading the Soviet Union in the late 80s, you can see what a different world we would be had he prevailed. Well, he didn't prevail. And I think in today's Russia, he's a voice that's not listened to or followed. But Steve, I think, has a very broad relationship in the Russian community in Russia. And I think I would say, as he has courageously said on a number of occasions, that America has an obligation to have a constructive relationship with Russia. You cannot dismiss Russia because you don't like Putin. Russia is a great country, much smaller country than the one we had to deal with the Soviet Union. Much smaller, much less powerful than that. But it's a country that's as great a nuclear power as we are, and you can't have peace in this world unless you work out the problems that divide us. I believe we can work them out. I think Steve does too. But it takes a very different attitude. John Bolin is not going to give you the kind of advice that would straighten it out.
Yes.
Was it Roosevelt's belief that the U.S. did not have sufficient forces available to do more to fight against the Holocaust?
Not at all. The Holocaust was something that began after the invasion of Russia in June 1941. The persecution of the Jews, of course, began long before that. But no one had any concept that something that represented the industrial organization of murder could possibly take over a country like Germany and proceed to murder not just 6 million Jews, but 9 million others who were not Jews, who were people of illness or disabilities or different sexual orientations. No, I think the problem was that once the Second World War began, there was no way the Jews could get out of Europe. And there was no way that we could force them out without beating Hitler as fast and as thoroughly as we possibly could. I think Roosevelt's determination to have unconditional surrender was related to that. He was not going to negotiate with anyone as to what they had done to the Jews. Time and again, he said that those who caused these crimes must pay the full price. He died before the war ended, and that was a shame of him, because I think one of the great criticisms of everyone is that those who perpetrated the Holocaust were not sufficiently punished. But I do not believe, and I hope you'll take some time to read the essay that's part of this book about the extraordinary efforts that were made by many countries. But it was a situation that you could not breach.
We'll do one more and then go upstairs and celebrate the book. Yes, right there.
Bill, I wonder if we could take the poetry of Haney to the realpolitik of the campaign. Can you give us any guidance and wisdom as to where this should go or will go? I mean, the 2020 presidential, of course.
You mean what advice about this campaign?
Yeah. What should we do? Where should we go?
I don't think that I have much to offer. I think the world is so different. When I see social media, for example, I mean, I'm not playing at Facebook. I'm not a Googler. I see all of you people, you're pulling out your watches, your phones. It's wonderful, but that's not who I am. So I don't know the world that you have to rule and organize. I know this, that we're in the midst of a revolution greater than the Industrial Revolution, and that peoples and nations have been fragmented by a number of things that are going to cause very difficult times for us to work without the unity that requires. I don't think age is a particular factor. I mean, I can see the attraction of someone like Joe Biden, who could at least stand up to Trump and say, you don't know what you're talking about, and I do. And I think he's probably as good a candidate as you can get. I'm very worried, though, about this election. I think that we have to be very careful how we treat Trump. He's a con man of extraordinary capacity. And he is, the most important thing is to demand in the presidency a commitment to truth. If you cannot have a president and an administration that we can trust as American citizens, we've lost the vitality and the possibility of it. As I've watched day by day, Trump denying every kind of thing, just lying. I say you can't be America and have that kind of leadership. So I would say to all of us, and I'll do what I certainly can, is that this is an election that requires us to just work as hard as we can. I would travel around the country if I were young people as much as I can. I remember Jimmy Carter's Peanut Brigade in New Hampshire that we organized so that people would know who Carter was. And they came from Georgia and said, this is who Carter is. He's my governor, he's my neighbor, he's this. I think Americans have to know each other again, have to go out and talk to each other. I think the trade struggles that we're now engaged in may give us that opportunity. And ultimately, we have to remember that our strength as a nation that has made us who we are, which is the greatest nation in the history of the world, that comes from a union, that we've survived much together, that we must survive much more together. We have to stand by our brothers and sisters who have been injured by the processes of slavery and racial vicissitude, for example. But we have to come into this not alone as Democrats or as Republicans, but as Americans, and to have a united country as a real victor of the next election.
Thank you.
So, Bill, your wonderful eloquence, we are all just waiting to read the book and to read the rest of the stories. But tonight, Harold and I wanted to announce a particular honor for you right here at Roosevelt House, and to tell all of our audience that we're launching a campaign this evening to rename a historic, a really almost sacred spot here at Roosevelt House in your honor. As you know, FDR came back from Averell Island to this house in 1921 to recover and rehabilitate from his devastating bout with polio. His mother, of course, wanted him to return to Hyde Park and gracefully retire and just get off the stage. But Eleanor insisted that he head here to New York City, where he could re-engage with the world, thanks to the high-tech, because it was high-tech, innovation that his mother had incorporated into the East 65th Street house when she built it years earlier, of course, the elevator. So with this elevator, Franklin regained his confidence and his energy, and in some ways, his mobility. Soon he was traversing the halls in his specially designed armless wheelchair, and soon he was maneuvering between floors by using the elevator. Bill, as you know better than anyone, when we rehabilitated this building, we intentionally, and you and I discussed this, preserved one of the historic elevators. We have one that's ADA compliant, but we kept one tiny but history-rich space that brings us closer to FDR than perhaps any other spot in the house. So tonight, we launch a campaign to name it officially, and for the very first time, as the Ambassador William J. vanden Heuvel Franklin D. Elevator Roosevelt Elevator. So I hope you will all help us and to rename this wonderful elevator, this piece of history.
Does that mean I'm an elevator operator?
And unionize. Please join us upstairs to toast this
Wonderful.
extraordinary man, because happy days are here again.
Thank you, thank you.